So welcome everyone to the VOD TV real-time conversation in cooperation with the WCA. Thank you very much, WCA, for supporting this. And thank you to our speakers. We have Andrew Clegg from Google, Richard Bernhardt from WISPA, Chuck Lukaszewski, and I'll get that right someday, Chuck, from Aruba/HPE Enterprises, and Chuck Yorkgitis from Kelly, Drye, and Warren. And it's really fun. We've had a lot of fun in the last week kind of playing off the idea of getting the band back together and to Wi-Fi on beyond. And I guess I'm probably not a really good marketer because we probably should be sticking with a theme. But the theme is kind of that dual thing, the fact that there's a lot still happening in Wi-Fi and in other unlicensed and shared spectrum. And we talked about that about 3 months ago. I can't believe it was 3 months ago already. And we had a great set of speakers. WCA organized this event. I think it was January 28th in Santa Clara at HPE Aruba's headquarters. And we actually left with still a lot of things unanswered. I mean, I had a whole pages here of questions. And recently, the FCC came out with their notice of rulemaking that they'll vote on the 23rd of April. And so that we thought, well, it would be fun to get the band back together, as they say. And maybe at the end of this, we'll even tell you who the band is, but the band in the picture. But first, let's get it started. Chuck, you're going to kind of take us through some overheads that you put together. We're going to focus to begin with on today's presentation on the Wi-Fi 6E, the order that is going to be voted on, and it could really be revolutionary. So why don't you kind of take us through what that means from a spectrum standpoint, and then we'll transition.
Yeah, that sounds great. So you should be able to see the screen now. If you could just confirm.
It's dark at the moment, Chuck.
Okay. It says I'm sharing.
Yeah, I might have to try it again. I think it was, I jinxed us by suggesting that everything was working great.
Yeah, try that again. Okay, how about now?
Yes.
There it is.
Okay, great. Yeah, and so for those who don't know me in the audience, so I'm Chuck Lukaszewski. I'm VP of Wireless Strategy here at Aruba, and so I look after, among other things, next generation products and spectrum policy. And so in that context, I've been involved in the 6 gigahertz effort, along with a whole bunch of other companies, including some of the folks on this webinar. And so just want to let you just very quickly have a high level view of kind of where the commission has come down. We are about a year and a quarter, year and a half, I guess, depending on how you count, into a rulemaking. And the commission on April 2nd announced that they, Chairman Pai announced that they plan to move ahead at the April open meeting on the 23rd with a draft order to open the 6 gigahertz band for unlicensed applications. And that includes not just Wi-Fi, but any unlicensed technology that comports with the rules. And so this is also potentially a big deal for unlicensed LTE or new radio unlicensed types of radios and other types. So the order contemplates 4 different kinds of devices. And for those of you who maybe haven't been following the proceedings, so this is just kind of a quick scorecard. So first of all, with respect to the band structure, so going from left to right, because it's such a significant amount of spectrum, and we'll talk about the significance of that later, but there are 4 new uni bands, right? So in the 5 gigahertz range, we have Uni 1 through Uni 4, and now in 6 gigahertz, we'll have Uni 5 through Uni 8. And 2 of those bands, the Uni 5 and Uni 7 bands, will have what are called standard power APs. So these are indoor-outdoor devices that operate under the control of what's called an automatic frequency coordinator. It's a spectrum database similar to what you have in the CBRS band or the TV white spaces band, but we think a much simpler implementation due to the nature of the incumbents here. The red X on the right is that the industry had proposed that the FCC declined to extend that up into the lower part of the Uni 8 band, but that's the first device class. The second device class is what are called low power indoor APs. So these are indoor only, and there are some very specific rules to prevent the leakage of indoor devices outdoors. And in this case, the FCC went with a new kind of a power limit. So instead of the traditional maximum EIRP type cap that we've used in the past, in this case they're using a power spectral density value, which is 5 dBm per megahertz. And we'll talk about what that means later. And then there's a class of devices called very low power. So if you think that the first two classes are basically fixed devices, they're plugged into a wall or they're plugged into cables. So what do you do about, say, a smartphone that's tethering on the end of a 5G connection, or maybe a vehicular access point in your car, or what have you? So those are very low power APs. The commission decided that the record needs more work here, and so the order includes a further notice of proposed rulemaking that they intend to complete quickly, but essentially that is unresolved. And then finally, for client devices, they're going to have to be 6 dB below whatever the access point is to which they're connected. So that's kind of the quick reference card. And then just to sort of put the spectrum in context, both in the US and in Europe. So there are, it's 1200 megahertz, and I've color coded. So the green channels in Uni 5 and Uni 7 are indoor or outdoor with AFC. And then the Uni 6 and Uni 8 channels are indoor only, and those would be LPI only. As compared with Europe, which is preparing to move ahead with the lower 500 megahertz of the band, and that'll be of the device classes that we just spoke about, they're going to move ahead with, it looks like, indoor only. And then the very low power class that the FCC decided to kick into a further notice, Europe is, it looks like, going to move ahead with that just from the very beginning. So that's this is an incredibly significant development. The rules that are proposed, we think are going to do a good job of protecting the incumbent operations. Obviously, we are an unlicensed service, and these are licensed bands with tens of thousands of existing users across the United States. And as is always the case of Part 15 equipment, we operate on a non-interference basis, and we think that these rules are a good balance here, and will unlock just a complete wave, new wave of innovation. So we're very grateful to the commission. We're very grateful to Chairman Pai and everyone else that's worked so hard on this.
Chuck, that's a great setup for the rest of the conversation. And before we transition to you, Chip, there's a question coming on from YouTube. Any idea on what the power levels will be in Europe? ? Are they going to be the same?
Yeah, great question. So it's broadly speaking, we do know it's not nailed down to the exact value, but it's going to be either 23 or 24 dBm, right? Which is basically 200 to 250 milliwatts. The exact number is just being finalized now. So it'll be less than the US, and then for the very low power, we're looking at 25 milliwatts or 14 dBm.
Thank you. That I think that answers that question. So now I think we'll transition to Chuck. I mean, there's obviously a number of questions that will come up. For what you just presented, I had a number myself, and I'm sure other people will. But let's transition to Chuck, and that requires me to hopefully figure out how to share my screen, which I think I'm doing here. And we are going to take a look here at the a chart rather, from the FCC's document. Is that right, Chip? Whoops, Chip, I think you're on mute.
I sure was. Thanks, Ken.
No worries.
I wanted to say hello to everyone that's joined. Hope you're all staying healthy, continue to stay well. during this crazy time. I'm Chip Yorkgitis, a partner at the law firm of Kelly, Drye & Warren. My offices are in Washington, D.C., and I advise a number of clients on spectrum management matters. Just wanted to talk about, complement what Chuck said with just giving you a sense as to who is it that these unlicensed devices will be sharing with. These are the incumbents in the band, and by category, in the bands that will be available for outdoor use at the standard power access points, the Uni 5 and Uni 7 bands. The primary users there are fixed microwave users, utilities, pipelines, railroads, mobile carriers that use the band for microwave links to support their operations, public safety, and others. And also the FSS uplinks are in this band. Particularly wanted to focus on the Uni 7. This band of spectrum pairs in large part with the C-band satellite spectrum, another major order that came out from the Commission in February, and will be implemented over the course of the next several years, with a big date coming up in December when the chairman and of the FCC hopes to commence the auction there on December 8th. So the paired spectrum is here. And then you also have broadcast auxiliary services and cable television relay services in Uni 6 and Uni 8. And the primary proponents there in making sure that the spectrum is protected are the National Association of Broadcasters and the cable companies. The order has not yet been voted on, as Ken and Chuck both mentioned, and lobbying will continue through the 16th. But I think a lot of what Chuck said is probably pretty much good to go. Well, I don't expect major changes, but wanted to focus on just a couple points regarding the draft order. What Chuck didn't mention, is not mentioned here on this graph because it's not an incumbent use, is that CTIA and the mobile carriers made a push, a heavy push at the end to try to make 600 megahertz, the top 600 megahertz of the band, available for licensed use. Their plan was to not only prevent the unlicensed carriers to, or unlicensed proponents to get access to the spectrum, but also to clear the incumbents and make this available for exclusive licensing. That order, that the Commission pretty soundly rejected that idea and rejected the idea of exploring it further in a further notice of proposed rulemaking, saying that that would run contrary not only to the goal of having significant new opportunities for unlicensed operations, but also contrary to their intent to protect existing incumbent services. The other thing I'll mention is that the Commission faced a lot of back and forth in terms of competing studies during this proceeding, and in particular with regard to some of the uses that the indoor uses that would not be controlled by automated frequency coordination, the AFC systems, but also with regard to the sufficiency of the AFC systems for outdoor use. And the fixed microwave community in particular was very strongly engaged in providing their view of what was necessary to protect them. And it's kind of interesting because we're going to be talking about sharing spectrum today, that the Commission, they stated pretty pointedly in the draft order that, and this was in response to AT&T, that was saying that there are going to be so many unlicensed devices in this band that even with your proposed protections, there will be harmful interference. And the Commission said, and I'll just read this from the draft order, whether it's in the final order in this way remains to be seen, but they say that were we to act on every unrealistic or contrived situation that purports to show the potential for harmful interference, our rules would allow for few or no opportunities for sharing between unlicensed devices and licensed services. And now they underscored also in that same paragraph that the unlicensed devices are secondary and have to operate on a non-interference basis. But the reason I bring that up is not necessarily to endorse it, but just to point out that the Commission is trying to balance a lot of competing potential uses here, and they're trying to move away from worst case scenarios and how they think about spectrum management. Turning back to the CTIA proposal for the upper 600 megahertz, this was part of their effort to foster a pipeline beyond the recent C-band order for more exclusive licensed mid-band spectrum. And you can drop the slide now, Ken. In addition to that proposed 600 megahertz that CTIA and the mobile industry was advocating, at the same time, they've been pushing for access to other 3 gigahertz spectrum. So there's already the CBRS spectrum, which Andy will be talking about a bit, and the C-band order, which makes available 280 megahertz eventually through auction. But right below that, at 3.1 to 3.55, is a band that's primarily used by federal agencies right now, particularly DoD, for radar systems. And it's an important band for DoD, but this is sort of the next target by the mobile industry. And the question is whether they'll be sharing or exclusive access, and to how much spectrum. It's kind of interesting that right after the draft order came out, just Wednesday of this week, Commissioner O'Reilly wrote a letter to the White House saying that the only potential source of large swaths of spectrum in the midband for 5G commercial wireless are in 3.1 to 3.55, and Commissioner O'Reilly asked President Trump to lean on DoD to make available this spectrum, not necessarily just for shared purposes, but on some of it on an exclusive basis. And we're awaiting some additional studies from NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, part of Department of Commerce, which has sort of FCC-like roles, although it's not a one-to-one comparison, with regard to federal executive agencies and their use of the spectrum. And NTIA is due to come out with a report. It's actually a couple weeks overdue right now, but very soon, on the prospects for sharing of spectrum in this 3.1 to 3.55. And before I give up the mic, I think I'd be remiss not to mention just very briefly, because it also falls into the spectrum sharing category, some of the COVID response that has occurred over the past month. Beginning in mid-March, the Commission was making some special temporary authority available to some of the mobile carriers and others for access to spectrum that they weren't currently licensed in. This access would be on an emergency special temporary authority for 60 days on a secondary non-interference use basis, but it required that those providers, which include T-Mobile, AT&T, Verizon, US Cellular, they get consent of the existing users. And Richard may talk about this later, but the Commission also provided special temporary authority to over 30 internet service providers to get, again, special secondary access in the 5.9 gigahertz band. One other action, and then I'll pass it off to Andy, is on, if you hadn't heard, 2 weeks ago, the Commission, because of COVID, has delayed the start of the 3.5 gigahertz auction for 4 weeks currently. We'll see if they feel a need to make any further extensions. So that will begin on July 23rd, not June 25th. So, but they are hell-bent on staying to the schedule for the C-band auction, the 3.7 to 3.98 on December 8th. But with that, and having mentioned that, I'll pass it back to you, Ken.
Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff that you've just talked about that I have follow-up questions. I'm sure we'll have great discussion on that. And one of the things I think, and you mentioned this earlier, the AFC, and that really is a form of spectrum management. And I think that is the logical flow into the things you're doing, Andy, at Google and spectrum management. So why don't you talk to us about that?
Sure. All right. Thanks, Ken, and thanks, Chuck and Chip before me. So we're here to talk about spectrum sharing. So I figured I'd give you an update on our sort of primary shared spectrum band that's happening today. Give you an update of where it is and what's going on. So CBRS formally kicked off on January 27th, which was actually the day before all of us were together for that panel at HPE Aruba. So that was fortuitous timing back then. So the lower tier in CBRS is currently active. It's being commercially deployed right now. That tier is the General Authorized Access, or GAA tier. Deployments of GAA are in full swing. And as of today, we have many thousands of CBRS base stations that have been deployed and brought online. And in fact, we continue to see many base stations being brought online every day, even through the pandemic. So it gives you kind of an idea of how enthusiastic the CBRS operators are at getting their equipment out and getting it up and running. So our SAS and the other SASs have been very busy authorizing lots of CBSDs in the band. The good news, since we're here talking about shared spectrum, the really good news is that there have been no reports of interference from either the DoD or any of the other incumbents operating in the band, which is a good thing. So shared spectrum does in fact work, as we're proving today for the last few months. And for those of you who are not as familiar, there are 4 spectrum access systems currently in operation. The spectrum access system is the system that manages the base stations to make sure they don't interfere with the incumbents. There's 4 companies operating spectrum access systems right now. We expect another one to be authorized very soon. I think the close down of the government almost because of people having to work from home, I think has slowed things down, but we expect them to be authorized very soon. So Chip mentioned the auction coming up. So for those of you not familiar, there's a higher tier of CBRS service called priority access licenses that give you some interference rights in the band. Those are called PALs. So the FCC, as Chip mentioned, has the auction currently scheduled to begin July 23rd. There's up to 7 10 megahertz licenses available in each of about 3,000 counties around the United States. So there will be about 21,000 licenses up for auction. They did push the auction back a month because of the COVID-19. You have until May 7th to file a short form application to participate in the auction. So if you're going to participate and you want to bid for PALs, you have to let the FCC know all about you and which PALs you want to bid on and a variety of other information, and you need to file that by May 7th. That's just 1 day less than 4 weeks from today, so not a whole lot of time left. If you plan to participate in the auction, one thing I would like to get out as a SAS administrator and also as one that has helped set up the standards for this band, it's very important for you to understand what exactly you're buying because of the incumbent operations, both the DoD and the fixed satellite service incumbents. Not every county is created equal. There are some that are going to be a little more encumbered because of DoD operations or because there's a satellite system you need to protect nearby. You need to know that before you go and bid on a license. And there's the vast majority of the country is completely open at all CBRS frequencies. But if you're going to go and bid, especially in coastal areas, you do need to do a little bit of due diligence to understand what exactly you're bidding for as a function of frequency and location and other things. So to that end, myself and several other members of the Wireless Innovation Forum put together a very detailed document that explains all of the incumbents and encumbrances in the band. It's a bit of mind-numbing reading, but if you're going to go through the trouble and expense of participating in the auction, you really should take a look at it. The document is in the process of being formally balloted at the Wireless Innovation Forum, but because the auction is coming up, we've posted a draft version of it on the Wireless Innovation Forum website. Go to wirelessinnovation.org, hit the Knowledge Center link, and then hit the information document link, and that will take you to it. It's posted there. I'll send that to you, Chip, and or to you, Ken, and you can put that in the chat window if you want. We also encourage you, if you're going to participate in the auction, you really should talk to a SAS administrator as well, because they can give you even more details about the incumbents and the encumbrances. So the message is, if you're going to participate in the auction, you need to be aware of what it is you might get when you bid. So look at that document, talk to a SAS administrator. I think it's very, very important. So what are we doing now? The CBRS industry is very busy in developing the standards for next generation CBRS. We're not sitting still. This first generation, we've opened up GAA, we'll be opening up PAL later this year after the auction. But we're moving forward with expanding the capabilities of the spectrum access systems and making even better use of the band. We're incorporating new features into the next generation standards, such as be able to use beamforming antennas, support for passive distributed antenna systems, enhanced propagation models that have a lot more knowledge about clutter like buildings and foliage and things like that. So all sorts of exciting developments that will be incorporated in SASs shortly after, probably beginning later this year and into next year. So the bottom line, so far so good. CBRS is working, lots of deployments, even given COVID-19. No interference, so spectrum sharing is working. We're looking pretty forward to the rest of the year.
That's a terrific update. Two questions that want you stew on these while we go to Richard. But the two questions I have, first will be the relationship to Wi-Fi 6E, or the 6 to 7 gigahertz in the AFC, and compare and contrast those. So we'll come back to you on that. And the other question is something I'll have to come back to because I forgot it already. But that's why I asked you that question, because I knew I'd forget it.
Thanks,
so with that, let's move on to Richard, because his group, his people have been right in the midst of everything, of expanding bandwidth, I guess, building the car while the car is driving, or whatever you call it. So Richard, why don't you tell us a little bit about WISPA and some of the challenges and opportunities that your folks have faced recently?
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it. So it's an interesting time, and I think Andy and the previous speakers sort of outlined the fact that how much stuff is in play. I don't think in the history of the FCC has there been so much potential for change and so much opportunity being put forth, and with it the politics that go with the day. And so we've mentioned 3100 to 3550, which is just getting discussed. CBRS, which is 3550 to 3700, which has had 4 years of serious work done on it. C-band, which is 37 to 42, and now 6 gigahertz, which ranges the whole of most of 6 and lower 5, 5, 9, and more. And the fixed wireless industry, the wireless internet service providers, and those that provide services point to point and point to multipoint, do so on a daily basis, and they do so searching for new spectrum and new ways to deliver, especially in rural and suburban parts of the United States, which are really being focused on now with the COVID-19 situation. And I want to report, we've had several large conference calls with WISPs across the United States, just trying to get a beat on where they are with COVID-19 and whether or not the services that they have are being sought out. And they are looking very tired. Let's put it that way. They're deploying many new links. They have been hit on very hard, and we're very happy about this, by schools and libraries and agencies that are trying to deliver signal out to people who can't be at their facilities at this point. Some of them are doing it for free. Some of them are doing it on a subsidized basis. But the truth is, and I think it was Chip said that the stays that were offered are being used, that a considerable number of them are using supplemental spectrum in the 5.9 DSRC range in order to deliver their products. And I think you are going to find that 6 gigahertz is widely used by WISPs as well, mostly on the outdoor basis, though they'll also support many of the functions that happen indoor as well. And the things as Aruba does and the others do are clearly going to be very, very valuable going forward, because our new normal, we need to think that that's a cliche saying, but our new normal is now going to involve a lot more online use for both critical services and day-to-day affairs. And so I want to talk a little bit about where 6 gigahertz is with this, and talk just very briefly about CBRS. And I'm going to talk for just 2 seconds on the transition from Part 90 to Part 96, which is a subject that is affecting both the existing incumbent users of 3650 to 3700 and CBRS. So let's just start with 6 gigahertz. The two outdoor frame 5925 to 6425 and 6525 to 6875 are really really a good thing. Tweaking the rules to make them work for all that need this service are obviously going to be something where the standards organizations and stakeholder groups are going to be working on for some time. But unlike the process that we went through with CBRS, which was fairly extensive and involved, mostly because it involved military agencies and a lot of very varied incumbents, I see this playing out much quicker. And I think it's also the motivation of both the agencies that are interested in this and the government and the FCC to move it along as quickly as possible. So the development of AFCs and ones that'll work effectively to protect the incumbents. And by the way, WISPs are very much incumbents in 6 gigahertz. They use point-to-point backhaul from 6 gigahertz. So they both need to be protected and also need the benefit of using the band. And so we see it as a natural extension of what the Wi-Fi users are doing, but also a methodology for expanding into new spectrum and protecting those incumbents that are there. I can speak to any questions that come up on users or WISPs that are interested in the use of 6 gigahertz in their networks or how users will be using it. But that's about all I have to say about 6 gigahertz for right now. Let me quickly transition into Part 90. Those of you who have licenses or use licenses in Part 90, Subpart Z, Subpart C covers 3650 to 3700, which is the upper part of the CBRS band now. There are concurrent licenses that operate with CBRS at the moment and will now until at least October of this year, and there are some that extend as far out as 2023. But for the most part, most of them were set to sunset in April of this year, and because of COVID-19 and because of supply side issues and other issues that happened, the FCC has extended out the licenses for grandfathered wireless and for Subpart Z till October 17th of 2020 this year. And that hopefully will be a sufficient time for those people who are operating, and there's some 40,000 of those things deployed. So it's a very significant number of access points and clients that are out in the field and being used in that band. And why is that significant in this discussion for a shared spectrum discussion? Well, it falls squarely into what GAA spectrum is for CBRS. And so the transition is both vitally important for making sure that interference doesn't happen and the protections stay in place, but also vitally important because that set of spectrum will be widely used and is already being widely used. So this transition will actually boost the amount of people who are in CBRS. So if you are a licensee under Part 90, you need to check very closely with with Part 90, not just the ULS. Make sure that your license is what it when it expires. There may be some discrepancy in the times. You need to make sure when your license expires. And the transition itself involves going into CBRS equipment, which means that there are standards and things that you have to meet in order to make that transition. It's not an automatic transition, and you will need to sign up with a SAS, and you will need to, in most cases, use a CPI or certified professional installer to do your equipment transition. Not necessarily a hard transition, but it is one that will take some time. And the last thing I would suggest there is, if you have equipment, especially equipment older than 2 years old, I would definitely contact your manufacturer to find out whether or not your equipment is going to be compatible or can be made compatible with CBRS. It does have to go through testing. It's just not an automatic thing. So you verify whether or not the equipment you have can be transitioned into Part 96. And now on to CBRS. So CBRS is a very exciting area for the fixed wireless community, especially for WISPs in rural communities. Provides vast opportunities for new use and new spectrum, for extending networks, for providing for private networks and neutral host networks eventually. It is a band that is in play, and as Andy said earlier, ready for business. We're already operating and have a good number of CBSDs and GAA. The auction will be coming up in June, or excuse me, is it June? June, for the July. I'm sorry, the auction got moved to July 23rd for CBRS. And you should very carefully look at Andy and his fellow cohorts' document on encumbrances if you are interested in participating in the PAL auction. PALs are not the same as a standard license that you may have purchased before if you've gone through a license auction previously with the FCC. The differences are pretty subtle, but they're very important. One, you're not applying to get a specific spectrum band. You are not going for these 10 megahertz or these 20 megahertz. You are going for access to a specific amount of spectrum. You can buy up to 40 megahertz of spectrum in the PAL auctions, and the PAL auctions are county by county. So you can pick your county, or you can pick a number of counties, and you can make your bids based upon the rules that they've set forth. But they're different in that the SAS will be assigning you that spectrum. It's dynamic. It may change. We expect that they're going to do their best to keep it as contiguous as possible between counties and as stable as possible inside each one of the counties. But it is CBRS. The spectrum band for a PAL can move if it needs to be moved. The other thing is that the encumbrances that Andy talked about are ones that you definitely need to consider, because if you don't, you may end up with something that's less than whole. So when you review what you're interested in, look at the area, look and speak with your SAS, see if there might be ESCs in that area that could cause you some issues. Look to see if there's FSS satellites or other things which might encumber the areas that you're looking for. So just to sum up, if you are interested, or if you're a WISP or a fixed operator or someone using a fixed operator, we're going to really benefit, and those people all across the country are going to benefit by 6 gigahertz. Just think of it this way: 5 gigahertz and 2.4 gigahertz were considered to be the garbage spectrum when they were put out there. They're probably the single most used spectrum in the world at this point, generating well over $1 trillion in revenue across the world. So where is it going with 6 gigahertz? It can't be anything but good. In the Part 90Z, 3650 to 3700 world, make sure you understand your transition into CBRS. Look over the spectrum and license requirements that you have and make it happen as soon as possible so you don't get stuck. If you do need to extend it further, there is a provision to be able to work with the FCC on that. And with CBRS, what's holding you back? Start putting up your CBSDs. We're ready for business.
Wow, that was a great summary. Especially you triggered that old saying, "What's one man's garbage is another man's," or one man's garbage is another man's gold, right? And it sounds like we may be hitting a spectrum gold mine here, and that I think leads to whoever wants to respond to this. But with 1.2 gigahertz of spectrum suddenly available, how does that inflate the market, if you will? Does it kind of take away from some of these other bands? Are people going to say, well, you know what, I've got tons of spectrum over here. Do I need this other spectrum?
Yeah, so I'll take a first cut at that. So let me actually, before we get to that, let me just comment on the breadth of the spectrum, and maybe pick up on Chip's mention of the sort of the alternative proposal to clear and license the upper half of the band. So I just published an article sort of today, putting on the Aruba website. I can send you a link, talking about the historical context of this decision in the context of the original 1997 order that created the unibands in 5 gigahertz, and then the subsequent and that was 300 megahertz, which was unprecedented at the time. And then about 6 years later, there was a follow-up order that created the DFS bands and added another 255 megahertz. But when the commission acted in 1997, 2G was state of the art. Right, the first 3G deployment anywhere in the world was 5 years away in Japan, and the 3G channel sizes, the biggest one was about 10 megahertz. So to put this in context, what the FCC did at the time was basically place a bet on 30 times the width of the next generation cellular channel width for completely unknown applications. And as was just pointed out, it was considered principally junk spectrum. So there weren't a lot of people competing for it necessarily. So fast forward to today, obviously we've seen how that bet worked out, right? So now, right, the 5G standards, right, 3GPP and the IMT 2020 folks recommend 100 megahertz as the recommended mid-band channel size for a 5G deployment. And so the 6 gigahertz order is about 12x, right, the size of the recommended channel. And so when you sort of put it in that context, it seems a little more reasonable, right, from a certain point of view. And the other thing I would sort of point out is part of the reason that particularly Wi-Fi has been so successful is that it's not centrally planned, and anyone can take advantage of it anywhere that they want. And what makes that possible is that it's a multi-channel system, right? And as anybody that's worked with a family radio, the ski slope, or if you're old enough to remember CB radios, you need a certain, if you have uncoordinated users, you have to have a certain number of channels to distribute the load. And really, with Wi-Fi technology, that's about 7 to 9 channels, depending on how you lay it out. And so what this order does is give us enough channels that we can finally deliver multi-gigabit speeds and be able to have that channel reuse, right? And we couldn't do it in 5 gigahertz, even though the technology has been capable of multi-gigabit for now 6 years, because there's just not enough spectrum available. So this order is going to really be profound in terms of unlocking whole new categories of use cases, where suddenly multi-gigabit at a range of 30 to 40 meters indoors through walls is actually really viable, and it's gonna really just be profound. I mean, we just can't, as Chairman Pai I think said in January at CES, that we're going to look back and wonder how we were able to do so much in 5 gigahertz, and it's going to be sort of the stone age of Wi-Fi, right? And so this really opens up the future. Thanks.
Anyone else care to comment? And specifically, do you think this will discourage people from bidding on licenses for CBRS? As an example.
No, I'll take that. I think there's distinctly different class of use when you go into licensed versus unlicensed, and level of service, quality of service, the ability to provide consistent service, to the point of 5 nines is typically falls into either a very large spectrum of unlicensed, where you've got backups and failovers and so forth, or you use licensed spectrum, and the licensed spectrum is there predominantly to give you really clean, available, predictable spectrum. Which is not to say you can't do that in Wi-Fi bands. You can certainly do that in Wi-Fi bands, but they have distinctly different purposes. I think you will continue to see an interest, and you will continue to see large dollar values coming out of licensed spectrum. There's no question about that. In terms of now we have lots more, will that get filled in? Let me darken back to 2005 when everyone was laying fiber. And they thought that they were just laying too much fiber because they were putting all this fiber out and no one was using it. And then come forward to 2020 and ask me how much issue there is with dark fiber. People will fill to capacity, right? It takes some time. The highway is open. Not every car will be on it the first day, but there's certainly a pathway with that to huge amounts of growth, technological experiments, finding new ways to do things, using new antenna fashions. As Andy said, Wind Forum is looking at beamforming and looking at DAS and looking at different kinds of ways of making the bands even more efficient. So even in that larger spectrum, we want to make the most use of the spectrum. And then spectrum sharing is the exact reason that we're doing this. As we're said, there's only so much real estate. How do we make it more effective? And shared spectrum does that for you. It gives you more use of that spectrum.
Yeah, I would just add one thing, Ken, just a small point. So the new 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi compared with the existing, added to the existing Wi-Fi, will provide fantastic opportunities for relatively short distance, low power, but tremendous throughput. So that's what it excels at. In the CBRS domain, there is a category B type device which is allowed up to 50 watts power compared to the 4 watt power that the AFC controlled devices and Wi-Fi are limited to. So in those cases, an additional complement to CBRS to Wi-Fi is the ability to put out higher power outdoor systems that can go a little bit further, do a little bit better, getting through the clutter and things like that. So it's a slightly different use case. But as Richard said, these aren't competing technologies. These are all, eventually complementary technologies. And we're just all trying to make the best use of spectrum that's shareable, that's out there.
And they could well be daisy chained, right? So, having Wi-Fi at the end of a CBRS link, right, is going to be a common use case. Same thing, Wi-Fi tethering on the end of a 5G radio is, and you can imagine even more hops than that, right, in the path.
Absolutely.
That makes sense, and it, complementary. One of the things from a timeline perspective, and I know you've put some charts up there before, Chuck, as far as from a manufacturing standpoint or equipment availability. But what about all the other things that have to come together, or potentially the AFC, our chip? Are there potential stumbling blocks from incumbent operators saying, wait, this process wasn't done correctly or something? So what sort of timeline do you think we're looking at overall, and are there phases, and then what are the potential roadblocks? And I'll open that up to whoever wants to start.
Well, I'll throw up the timeline. But you're asking specifically a 6 gigahertz question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it is specifically 6 gigahertz.
So I'll take a first pass, and then folks can jump in. So this is an updated timeline actually as of the last couple of days. So on the bottom we have the U.S. proceeding. The commission, as you said, is expected to vote on the 23rd. And I would be remiss in just reminding folks that it's expected to be a unanimous a 5-0 vote. And of course, I don't want to jinx anything, but it has been remarkable how broad-based the support has been for expanding unlicensed. It's not in any way a partisan issue. Everybody is behind it. And then some companies have talked about having commercial equipment primarily for the consumer market available by Christmas. Broadcom announced a complete set of 6 gigahertz embedded radio solutions back in January. And so I think you're going to see products on the market extremely quickly, which again is, I think, part of the reason for such bold action. In Europe, it's a little more nuanced. So Europe has been at work for about the same amount of time as we have been in the US, but of course they have a very different process and there's a lot more stakeholders. So we've just completed a series of reports. There's this final report 73. So now there's a couple of other reports that have to be finalized, and there will be an EC decision, which was originally targeted for November. It slipped to January, but we expect at that time the European Commission will adopt unlicensed use in that lower 500 megahertz. And from that point, the various European countries will have 6 months to transpose the order into national law. So again, you're looking at sometime in 2021 to have products on the market in Europe. But in the case of the UK, they're running a consultation right now, and they may jump the gun a little bit relative to some of the other countries. So that's it at a sort of a broadish level. The bottom line is products are in the pipeline now, and you're going to see them sooner than later.
Yeah, Ken, I'll just add to that a little bit. This is Chip. There's always room for snags, but I think there's a lot of experience that exists already with similar systems. The SAS systems in 3.5, which, as Andy indicated, they've been up and running. 4 of them are fully certified and ready to go. They may be the same ones that are interested in being AFCs, but I think a lot of the experience in doing the certification, the testing necessary for the standard power access points can look at prior precedents. There'll have to be guidance provided to the telecommunications certification bodies to make sure those parts of the Commission's order and rules, which will be enforced, if you will, through the certification process, that will have to be ironed out. So there are a number of pieces that have to come together, but I think that the Commission has prior to experience to build on. They certainly want to avoid some of the problems that occurred in the 5 gigahertz band with some of the dynamic frequency selection devices, the DFS devices that were operating outside the rules, didn't get certified properly, and were potentially causing interference to airfield terminal weather Doppler radars. So there will be a lot of care taken, but I think that experience makes these things a little more efficient as you go forward with these novel sharing regimes.
And if I can tack something on as well, I mean, we're really grateful. We meaning in this case the RLAN community, Wi-Fi community. I mean, the order, as drafted, really looks like if we focus on that top class of devices we spoke about, the standard power with AFC. We weren't sure really what to expect because so much of the last year has been focused on the other device classes, and of course there've been some, folks have filed and what have you, but we were prepared for, a lot of additional rulemaking basically before we could get to a decision, and similar to what we've just been through in the CBRS ban, and the Commission really took a different approach. The draft order basically is a complete package of AFC rules and framework, and it resolves a number of the obviously everybody sort of had an opportunity to make their case in the record, and a number of the most sort of contentious questions have been settled, and so the number of topics that need to be worked out between the different incumbents and the various equipment manufacturers and so on is really, I think, it's a well-scoped package, and I think it's achievable in a pretty short period of time. And that was only possible because the Commission has so much experience at this point with database rule sets and certification and so on. So we really owe a debt to everybody, in the wireless ISP community and the operator community and Google and other companies that have worked so hard for so many years to really get the regulators to the point where they can make such a big move in a shared spectrum context.
And I've got there's a couple of questions coming from online, but before we get to those, Andy, from an administrator standpoint, do you see some of the same SAS folks are also participating in this? And from a timeline perspective, is that doable?
Yeah, it's already happening. Some of the SAS administrators are taking an interest in the AFC. When I look at it, and this is we're just more of a personal opinion, the AFC concept is much simpler than the spectrum access system, and Chuck alluded to it earlier. It's because the incumbent you're dealing with is not the DoD, which is a very demanding incumbent. They also have a lot of secrecy behind what they do, literally. And so we can't know everything about them. And so therefore protecting them is a complex operation. It's also much more dynamic. They have ships that come and go and they pop up at a moment's notice and we have to protect them. In the AFC, you're protecting links that have to register with the FCC and are in a database, and you know everything about them, or you will know everything about them. So your dynamic requirements are much less. The time changes are much less. A big difference is in 6 gigahertz, you're not dealing with aggregate emissions. You're creating exclusion zones, and you either can or can't turn an AP on in a particular frequency or at a particular height in that exclusion zone. In CBRS, we have to consider the aggregate emissions from basically every base station that could be within as much as over 450 kilometers away from particular points in the ocean. And so all of the SASs have to exchange all of the information that each of them knows about all of their other base stations. It's a very complex operation, and the AFC is much simpler. So I think time to develop and test an AFC will be much less than it was in the SAS. Having said that, the SAS, it was a 4-year process to get from the rulemaking to the first authorized SASs. I hope for everybody's sake that time is cut by, a factor of 4 in the AFC case. But it's just, it's a little bit of a caution that depending on how the process is set up, it can be time consuming. And the commission wants to build trust in these things, so they have built-in time periods for trials and things like that. And even though the incumbent is not the DoD, you have 100,000, links in the band, more or less, and so there are some very critical incumbents to protect. So you do have some of the same issues impacting AFC that you do with SAS, but I hope for the sake of 6 gigahertz that the time to market for AFC is much shorter than it was to get a SAS launched.
And that makes sense. Chip, from a regulatory perspective, do you see like the big cellular carriers suing the FCC or something or anything like that because they're not getting their bandwidth?
Well, I don't think they'll be suing them. This is not a repeat of some of the fears about a suit by the satellite providers in the 3.7 to 4.2. That had a lot to do with issues of modifying licenses under the band and so forth. But modifying licenses, which the statute has certain restrictions on. Here, that's not the case. The incumbents are being protected. New incumbents can come in. They're not being frozen in place, and the AFCs will have to take that into account as new fixed links come online or new uplinks of various types. But there could be room for reconsideration. I mean, certainly you see in the record over the past few days that people are still having the virtual meetings, and so there could be some petitions for reconsideration, which could impact the speed at which everything gets worked out. There's an encouragement. The commission in the draft order encourages the industry, both incumbents and potential proponents, to put together a multi-stakeholder group to work out issues with regard to the implementation of the commission's rules. The commission is not going to oversee that; they're not going to convene it, but that could be another vehicle that's in place and maybe builds on existing discussions to facilitate a transition that ensures incumbents are protected and also allows these systems to come in.
So while we're on the topic of cellular carriers, this is something that's a little bit off topic, but I think given the circumstances and the fact that we have some real RF engineer experts here, I think it's worth asking. The question comes in, and hopefully I'm getting it right here, but 5G isn't the origin of the virus 19. I think what they're asking is 5G the cause of COVID-19. And you may have seen in England, I think there are some people who actually believe that that was the case, and they burned some of mini cells, some micro 5G cells that probably, who knows if they're even turned up now. But so I will let whoever wants to address that, and how does it relate potentially to concerns of, you know, other spectrum bands.
Can I put in my 2 cents on that?
Of course.
There is definitely a way 5G causes COVID to happen. There's definitely a way. If the installer has COVID and coughs on the radio, and the next guy within 24 hours comes and gets some of that stuff on himself by holding it and putting it on his face, there is definitely the way for 5G to be transmitted, or COVID to be transmitted via 5G. Slide of that, myths and fairy tales from the internet are things that most people like to do at this type of event, and they do it all the time. Conspiracy theories. The two things have nothing whatsoever to do with one another, and you don't have to be a scientist to realize that. One is a virus, and one is RF or EMF type emissions. Has to do with the power and the frequency you're using. People are mixing up what 5G is with the idea of spectrum. They're applying millimeter wave and calling that 5G. They're calling 5G 5 gigahertz. I think just do your homework, folks. This is a radio frequency standard. It's a protocol. It's using spectrum that covers many different bands. This is just fun stuff for people to put on the internet to get clicks.
Anyone else care to comment? I mean, one thought I've had is the fact that the closer you get the cells, the less power you need to have out of this client device, right? So it seems to me that in general that helps things as far as radiation, right? And not that there's a radiation issue anyhow, but.
Yeah, I just say, I observe I don't think we have anyone that works in what's called electromagnetic compliance in the session here, and those are the people who have the legal and technical obligation to make sure that devices are complying with the rules. But regulators have done a lot of work on this. There are very specific rules around emissions limits and tissue absorption limits that's based on good science. And all of these products comply, and they're very, very low power, as was just mentioned. So this is I understand people's sensitivity to it, and people of good faith can disagree on things, but as a microwave engineer, I sleep very well at night with the power levels that we operate at, and we fully comply with regulatory limits, which are based on really good science.
Let's move on to another question about this, and I'm going to add to this. The question was, are there any real CBRS end user devices available? I think that was already answered. For now, all is based on LTE new radio, right? So I guess that's the question. Are they all based on LTE new radio? No. And one of my kind of follow-up questions on that, on the deployments you have so far, I know there are a couple cell phones that are CBRS compliant. So I'm curious if those are being deployed.
Yeah, absolutely. There are, last time I checked, there's about 40 different models of CBRS base station available on the market. If you're interested in those that support LTE or 5G NR, you can go to the CBRS Alliance website. They have a list of certified base stations that support 3GPP base standards, which at the moment is mostly 4G LTE, but also working towards 5G NR. And by the way, the CBRS band is an official 3GPP 5G band, so it supports 4G and 5G 3GPP standards, as well as any other standard you want. It's technology agnostic. As far as the end user devices go, yes, there are many end user devices that are certified. The Google Pixel 4 phone has CBRS built into it. The Apple iPhone 11 has CBRS built into it. Samsung, I may get it wrong, Galaxy S10 Plus, don't quote me on that, has one of the Samsung models, and I believe it was that, has CBRS built into it. I believe there's an LG phone that has CBRS built into it. And then there are some Motorola, kind of nifty Motorola walkie-talkie type devices that have CBRS built into it and are able to do basically like the old IDEN that was on the Nextel phones. This is now built into these walkie-talkies they have for commercial and industrial users. I've used those. Those are very cool devices. And then a number of manufacturers have embedded devices that have CBRS built into it, modules that are ready to be incorporated in third-party devices. I think the last time I counted, there were like 30 different models of end-user device that have been certified. So there's a lot of stuff on the market already.
Let me just add also, there are at least one manufacturer, and I believe there will be more, that are also non-3GPP standards. Cambium Networks comes to mind, that have proprietary air interfaces. The great part about CBRS is that it is technology agnostic. You have to follow the rules, but you can use whatever technology fits.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I know after our last meeting, I did on my write-up. I did added a couple paragraphs about hotels in Miami that were gearing up, I think, for the Super Bowl, and they had put in some private CBRS networks. And I'm kind of curious in those scenarios where you maybe have kind of this private, I guess, LTE based on CBRS network. Do they act kind of as a neutral carrier then to the other, cell phone providers and stuff?
They can, depending on roaming agreements. Most of the CBRS networks that are up now, the private networks, are private networks. They're not for open roaming. They can be, but most of the ones that have been put up so far. You mentioned, one of the use cases. So CBRS was used in the broadcast of the Super Bowl, for example. The PGA Tour has been using CBRS to get the shot link data, the shot-by-shot information during PGA Tour events backhauled instead of relying on Wi-Fi. They basically allow the Wi-Fi networks to serve the patrons and the customers who were there watching the event. And then the sort of the business side of getting the data back that's part of the event has been handled over the CBRS network. And Major League Baseball has been installing CBRS at a number of their stadiums. NASCAR has been using CBRS. It's now installed in a number of their stadiums. Google did a demonstration with NASCAR last year, getting live streaming from the cars over CBRS. So there's a big, one of the big use cases for CBRS has been in sports arenas and things like that. You just happened to mention it, but yeah, there is a lot of interest in CBRS for a variety of applications.
And Ken, I think you want to distinguish between neutral host networks and private networks. They could probably be both at the same time, but two of the benefits of CBRS is that it can be a neutral host offering platform, which it goes to if I'm wanting to offer maybe 3 or 4 different ISPs services. I don't want to put up 3 sets of equipment. You use the equipment as the sort of the neutral place, and each equipment manufacturer goes through that set of equipment. It is definitely something coming up that we'll see more of in CBRS. And then private networks, especially private LTE networks, are networks that operate for exactly that purpose. So you have a network that is off the mainstream internet or standard providers platform, and as Andy was saying, you know, depending upon the roaming agreements, you choose how you want it to be.
It's almost like an open access network in the fiber world. It sounds like as far as the shared host model or the neutral host model, I suppose.
Yeah.
Here's a question from someone asking about Europe. So this might be yours, Chuck. Any chance more spectrum will be available later in Europe?
So the short answer is we hope and believe the answer is yes. I assume that the question is referring to the sort of the rest of the 6 gigahertz band above 6425. And you know, what we've been told by some administrations in Europe is that they want to they wanted to sort of start with a reasonable you know, enough bandwidth to really significantly expand where, you know, what Europe has today, and validate that, you know, Wi-Fi devices, or they're called RLAN devices in Europe, can safely coexist. And once we get a little, sort of track record in place, if you will, that the rest of the band would be considered for opening up. It's exactly the same incumbents in the two halves of the band, just like it is here. And there are some other complexities. There are certain countries that are actually licensing. They make money from licensing that portion of the band and so on. So some things that have to get worked through. And it was just easier to move forward with the 500 megahertz at this point. But we're optimistic about the future. I will say that I think the FCC's decision here really does set the bar for the rest of the world. Particularly for countries, so now, I think South Korea has indicated interest. I think Japan and India may be looking at the bands, and so, we're of the opinion that really the the entire 1200 megahertz, which, by the way, this is harmonized internationally at the ITU level, right? So. It's not, the U.S. situation is not unique, right? That's what, it's fixed microwave and satellite uplink worldwide. So there really is no reason in the wake of the FCC's decision not to start from a position of the whole 1200. Particularly coming out of the World Radio Conference, there was some attempt to do a worldwide study of cellular in the upper part of the band, and that was limited to just 100 megahertz in the very top end. So we hope that regulators will start, being, from as ambitious a point of view as the U.S. has.
That's really exciting to hear. Just that the U.S. is kind of leading in this area, and that's pretty cool. So I just realized we've been on for about an hour and 10 minutes. And Anders Nilsson says hello to you, Chuck, by the way. I assume it's okay that I use his name because I guess it's out on the internet. But so before we leave, do you guys have any closing comments on what we've been discussing? Anything we're leaving out that we should, leave our viewers with?
Just do your homework before you bid in the PAL auction. That's what I recommend. Okay, Andy, do your homework for the PAL auction. Richard, your face is up there, so it's your turn.
Earlier somebody asked about the COVID-19 and the 5G in the middle of light of that. And the purpose is not to provide that as a sarcastic answer. It's that, we're all trying to be safe at this point, and you should consider all of the things that come across. But as was noted, this is a band that and not just 6 gigahertz, all of these bands, they're studied very heavily before they're used. Is there the possibility of some health impact based upon radio waves? That's yet to be discovered, and I think it's something that we should continue to study. That being said, I'm very optimistic about what's happening right now in terms of the spectrum. We have a lot of bands in play. We have the NTIA, who will come out with a report not too long from now on other shared spectrum areas that they think the government may be able to share. Optimistic about what I'm seeing with CBRS. I'm optimistic about what all of the providers are doing right now to be responsive to COVID, and whether our new reality is as macro as we think it's going to be or not. I do see what we all do, whether it's in the indoor space or the outdoor space, whether it's in the telephone space or the fixed or the mobile space. It's all going to play a very important role moving forward. So getting this right and using it well is really important, and so hopefully everybody is doing their best part with it, because I think it's really, really important. One, right now, just to keep things stable, and two, worldwide for the future.
Chip, and those were great comments, by the way, Richard. Chip, any closing thoughts? It's almost 6 o'clock there in Washington, D.C., so I appreciate you hanging on with us.
No problem. Still quite sunny here. Very windy, though.
Uh-oh. You froze up.
We lost Chip.
Is only going to become more and more important as you move forward, because you're going to get access to more spectrum. You're going to have to do it on a shared basis. So I think that you're going to see more of that, and I would direct people to. We've talked a little bit about the federal government I think it was just in the past 2 or 3 weeks, that NTIA also released a short, they called it an addendum, but it was a short discussion conceptually of why more money is needed for the Spectrum Relocation Fund to look at sharing between federal systems and unlicensed uses as well as lightly licensed uses. So the federal government perceives this need, and it's because it's the future.
And we missed the first part where you said more of. I apologize.
Oh, sorry about that. More spectrum sharing. I mean, this is just the beginning, because if you're going to get access to more spectrum, you're going to have to figure out how to do it on a shared basis in almost all cases going forward. Well,
sharing is caring, and
Yeah.
Chuck, what are your closing thoughts?
Yeah, just to bring it home, I mean, I want to really acknowledge the commission, and not just the chairman, but all the commissioners. People may not remember, but Commissioner O'Reilly actually, it goes way back with shared spectrum, back to his time on the Hill when he was working on white space, right? So it's interesting to see so many of these things come together. But I think when people look back at this time, 20 years from now, over this 4 or 5 year period of time, a staggering amount of spectrum has been re-architected from the lowest, the low end of the EM band all the way up into above 100 gigahertz. If you look at the Spectrum Horizon, Spectrum Frontiers, the C-band, 6 gigahertz, you can sort of go on down the list, millimeter or 60 gigahertz. This commission has moved a staggering amount of spectrum and really kind of rezoned, if you will, the EM spectrum for the next couple decades worth of applications. And I think we'll look back on this as a really, really significant time. And this particular commission is particularly effective in sort of setting the table for the rest of the world to follow. So thanks. Appreciate it.
That's really good perspective, and I hope in 23 years when we reconvene, and because I think you said it was 23 years ago when they opened up that 20 times the amount of spectrum and gave us this Wi-Fi we're using now, that it'll be interesting to look back in 23 years and see what's happened. I so appreciate all you guys taking your Good Friday afternoon and spending it here with us, with VOD View viewers, and thank you everyone for sticking around, and for the future viewers, because this will be recorded, and hopefully it's on YouTube right now. And we will be back probably next Friday with another engaging discussion. I haven't figured out what that topic is yet, but I appreciate WCA, appreciate your help, Tom Hunt, in finding out who's giving us questions. And everyone have a great Easter weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy. And I'm going to end the stream if the folks on here can stay for a